Hello and 欢迎在 Delving into Asian Psyches, the podcast in which we investigate the pasts, presents, and futures of psychology in the Indo-Pacific. My name is Robin Weber, and today I'm joined by Chuan-Peng from China. So for this episode, I am delighted to have Professor Hu with me. He is a psychology professor at Nanjing Normal University and leading the Meta Self Lab at the institution's School of Psychology. After completing his PhD at Tsinghua University in Beijing, he pursued his postdoc at the Neuroimaging Center at Johannes Gutenberg University in Germany. He has done research in neuro and cognitive psychology, in which he investigates the cognition of the self and human perception using approaches in meta-science, modeling, and measuring. He is also among the founding members of the Chinese Open Science Network, which promotes open science practices such as open access, transparency, and reproducibility in the Chinese research community. Now you see we have lots of ground to cover in this episode, and I suggest we delve straight in. And with that, I want to welcome our today's guest, Chuan-Peng. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you. I'm really glad to be here to share some viewpoints on the psychology research in China.
Right. I'm looking forward to hearing from those. Now, for the start of each episode, I usually like to have a look back and see how psychology emerged in my guests' countries. And in the case of China, I think it's a very interesting one, as it's one of those in which psychology actually predates the modern state. And back when psychology emerged in China, the place where you're in, Nanjing, was actually still the capital. So for a starter, maybe you can give us an idea of when psychology emerged in China and in what environment. Perhaps you can also use your university as an example for that.
Yeah, sure. I think so. In China, we have a course, we have a lecture called History of Psychology. So usually it will introduce the history of how psychology is developed in China. We have like pre-psychological science and after psychological science. So pre-psychological science, usually we use the first psychology laboratory established in China as a time point to separate these two periods. Before that, as in West, we have like some ideas about psychology. But after that, we start into like modern psychology. So the first psychological lab was established in 1917 in Peking University. But the first department of psychology actually was established at that time, I think it was called Nanjing Advanced Normal College, because it was a college for teachers. And the first psychology department was established there. And of course, it was the precedence of our university, Nanjing Normal University. Then in 1921, Chinese Psychology Society was established. And then another important time point was 1951. So the Institute of Psychology at the Chinese Academy of Science was founded and started to doing research in psychology. But then comes to the reorganization of Chinese higher education. Maybe you have heard that before. So basically, it's the central government decided to reorganize all the universities and colleges so that they specifically focus on some area. For example, the university I got my PhD degree, Tsinghua University, was then focused on engineering and science. So at that time, I think most departments of psychology was just cancelled, and the faculties of the psychology department goes to Department of Education or sociology or anthropology. So for a long time, there was no Department of Psychology at all. And then because most education department was reorganized to teachers' school, or we call it normal university in China, because it was school for training teachers, but then they become universities and they keep normal in their names. So we have a lot of normal universities in China. So what these universities was originally for training teachers, and Nanjing Normal University, my university, is one of them. So the department then, most of the faculty of psychology department was moved to Department of Education. I think maybe from 80s, then the psychology started to just as all the other areas, we start to open up and to develop economy, and so the science also start to grow again. And then the faculties who originally studied psychology, but at that time they was in Department of Education, start to re-establish the Department of Psychology. For example, in our university, we have independent School of Psychology only after 2012. So I think after 2000, psychology is officially recognized by the central government as an independent discipline. So we have departments, but not all universities have departments, of course. I think maybe around 2010, as the economy of the nation grows, people become increasingly concerned about mental health, and the psychology become more recognized by society. Recently, I think because maybe two topics are highly concerned by the society and by the government as well. One is the brain science, because there are a lot of brain projects among different countries, and China also has its own brain projects. And the other is mental health. So I think a lot of resources was invested in the development of psychology. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. I think that lays it out in a broad kind of view. And one thing I noticed that you have mentioned the reintroduction of psychology. Perhaps you can also describe a little bit what happened in between and how it came to that.
Well, I think at that time, because the whole country is undergoing some, so for example, the Cultural Revolution and some other political events. So I think maybe most research was just stopped. So was psychology.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then after that time when the country started to open up again, psychology became a field that uptake in research interest again.
Yeah, I think it's relatively slow because there's no department of psychology at all at that time, at the very beginning, like in the 80s. What researchers are in the Department of Education. Only maybe around 2000, psychology started to really become an independent discipline recognized by the central government.
I see.
So before that is kind of a subfield of education or sociology.
Yeah. I'm sure it takes time to build a whole department and field of research. And psychology is also one of these very broad areas which has many different interests and fields. So one of them you mentioned is the brain science, and very prominent in that is the cognitive psychology, in which you're also active in. And often when I describe this to people unfamiliar with it, it's a bit of a blocky term. So maybe as an expert, you can help us unpack what do you mean by cognition and where does psychology play its role in its research?
Cognitive psychology, as you just said, is a subfield of psychology. So it studies how human brain as an information processor. So when we say something, when we hear something, right? In cognitive psychology, we will take the metaphor of a computer. You give us the computer some input, then it will process it and give some output. And for cognitive psychology, when we study human, we view the sensory input as the information that flows into our brain, and then how the brain processes this information and then give us output. For example, we say a sentence as a response, or we take some action. The purpose of cognitive psychology is to unpack, well, how to describe this process, how to reconstruct this process. Can we model this process? Is there some universal phenomenon or effect or pattern when we process some information? Of course, each field is quite active. For example, a lot of researchers studying vision. So how we process the information that perceived by our eyes, and also their auditory and many others. Of course, we have low level like sensory information processing. Then we have a higher level, for example, how we decide, make a decision like economic decision or social decision or moral judgment. What kind of cognitive process or how these kind of decisions are made from input to output. Of course, as a field, we still have a lot to learn. We have a lot to investigate, but we try to use the metaphor from computer science. So view human as information processor, and we can unpack the underlying processes. And then when we have brain images, we have a non-invasive technique to image the brain, what is happening in the brain, then cognitive psychology naturally combined with these kind of neuroimaging methods. So for example, functional magnetic resonance imaging or fMRI. So we can not only using experimental design to infer the underlying processes, but we can also scanning people's brain when they are making some decision, what they are finishing some task. So we can see what was happening when people doing something in their brain. And we can make a link between the cognitive task or the task they are doing and the brain regions is activated. So these two combined as a cognitive neuroscience, which is part of the brain science, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And I love the metaphor you've made with the computer, because the literal translation for the Chinese word for computer is just electric brain, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I appreciate how you lay out how cognitive research is practically done, and especially also with time and the history that it took to evolve. We can also see how it became more and more technically with brain scans, etc., which back in the early days when, let's say, the psychology was first reintroduced, they must have been at a very different stage. So I wonder, where does cognition stand today? As it seems to me, this field has been very prominent in China as a field of research. Maybe you can elaborate on how it came to that and how it is practiced today. For example, you could also use an example of your own work, how you utilize these measures.
Yeah, sure. So as I just mentioned, psychology in China was initially like somehow was grown up from the Department of Education. So of course, developmental and educational psychology is still, I think, the field that most researchers are engaged in. But I think around 2000, maybe a bit later, people starting to introduce cognitive psychology into China. So I think at that time, the early researchers started to introduce the idea of experimental psychology and using the like well-designed experiment to somehow review some cognitive mechanism of human brain. As EEG, so electroencephalogram, electricity, we can record it from our scope, and as well as fMRI, as just mentioned, and other non-invasive technique appeared. Cognitive neuroscience become really popular because for the first time in the human history, we can see the activity of brain, and so it was very exciting at that time. And I think the scientists around the world are very excited. So researchers in China also started to use this technique to study human brain. So now in cognitive psychology, most people, they somehow using some brain imaging techniques. For university, like the tier one research university, elite universities, they have enough resources. So many of them have fMRI for research purpose. So most of research there, they will use combined fMRI and cognitive and experimental psychology to study the brain correlates. For other universities, like our university, we also have like EEG technique, where most people will somehow combine them. So if you do not use this kind of technique, I think maybe you are disadvantaged, basically. So few people, when they write in the grant, they don't mention the brain imaging technique. They just saying that I'm going to behavior experiment. I think most comments would be, this is not enough. So I think now cognitive neuroscience, or at least combination between brain imaging technique and the behavior experiment, dominant cognitive psychology. I think another tradition in cognitive science is that we use computation modeling. Like the year before 2015, most people still using neuroimaging, people around the world, and the very few people using cognitive models. Now they start to combine cognitive models with neuroimaging techniques. But actually, cognitive modeling was really an old one. It was an old method in cognitive science and the cognitive psychology. Yeah, so in the cognitive psychology in China, most people will use combined experiments with brain imaging techniques. Without it, basically, it would be very hard for you to get some funding. That's my observation. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I can imagine it to be a very competitive field. You mentioned, as I broadly went over in the introduction, this 3M model with different approaches to be combined.
Yeah.
And as you've also briefly touched on just now, psychology is a field under challenge. Maybe you can expand on which obstacles in research you are trying to address with your work and how research in psychology can be improved?
Sure. It will go back to my training, actually. When I was doing my master degree, I replicated one famous experiment published in Science. Basically, which means if you are holding a heavy thing because you have some sense of physical weight, right? So when you're making a social judgment at the same time, you will give more weight to that thing, to that topic. And so basically, the idea is very fancy, right? Saying that physical feeling can affect our social judgment. Firstly, I try to do a new experiment based on this idea. I want to check whether the mental effect of heavy can also transfer to punishment. But then I didn't find anything. So whether or not participants hold heavy or light thing, the judgment were almost the same. So I think it's really weird. So I try to replicate the original study, and I replicate it and I get nothing. So no difference between the groups who are holding heavier or light the writing board. So then I contacted the original author. I write an email to the first author and then to the corresponding author. No one responded to me. It really gave me a feeling that this topic, or people who are doing research related to this topic, is unreliable. So then I kept track on how the field doing this kind of field replications. And then there are several, I think, widely spread events on the social media. So basically, a social psychologist from Cornell University, they found that the participant can predict the future. That paper was published in a journal of top tier journal in our field, and it invoked a lot of debate on social media. And then comes to the replication, the field replication of elderly priming experiment. Maybe you have heard of that, right? So a participant who was presented some elderly related words, and unconsciously they were primed about the concept of old. So when they're working out in the laboratory, their speed is slower as compared they work in the experiment. Researchers from Cambridge and Belgium, they replicated study and didn't find any priming effect. They published a paper, and then the original author was really angry and write a very critical blog. So that also evoked a lot of discussion among the social media, because I just have a field replication. So I think, okay, seems that something goes wrong. So then comes to a lot of discussion on social media, and then comes to the replication crisis, right? So people realize that a lot of published papers in psychology cannot be replicated. So I think at the end of 2011, Brian Nosek and many other researchers, they started a group and they tried to replicate 100 studies in psychology. And so they spent years to do that. I think in 2015, they published that paper in Science. So I think the title of that paper is Reproducibility of Psychology. So that time, people really start to pay attention to it. I mean, researchers who originally do not really think is a problem, they started to take it seriously. I think I'm concerned about this because I personally have two failure. I just described one. The other is when I was studying my PhD training, I trying to study whether or not people have like a preference to their own face. So usually people will process their own face like at a faster pace. So when we present a face or a long face object on the screen, and we ask you to discriminate is a face or not. If the face was your own face, you will like respond faster and usually more accurately. So we call it self-face advantage or self-face effect. During my PhD, I want to investigate whether or not this phenomenon also exists when the face was presented unconsciously. So we're presenting the stimuli to you, but you cannot aware of it, because we're using other stimuli to like mask it. In cognitive psychology, we have several techniques to do so. I conducted a series of pilot study, and I'm sure that I can replicate some well-established effect in the field. For example, I present the face using some device so that I can present one face to your one eye, and then I present a very dynamic, high contrast, colorful stimuli. So a dynamic keep changing another stimuli to your next eye. So basically, at first, you cannot see the face presented in this eye, but still, the sensory information is still inputting, right? So you keep seeing it. But I didn't find the self-face advantage. So when you present the self-face or other face, they appear to your awareness almost the same speed. But previously, there was a study saying that they found surface advantage using this kind of technique. So I have two field study and I concerned about the field. So I started to read a lot of blogs about how people doing research. And then I found that there was a lot of problem in the field. For example, p-hacking, maybe you had it now, which means that you torture the data until it to be significant. And we also have a lot of other questions. For example, you have a hypothesis A, but after you conduct your experiment, you found a different pattern. And then when you're writing the paper, you write in the introduction that I have predicted B and I conduct the experiment and I get the hypothesis confirmed. So you actually hypothesize after you examine the data. And we also have other problems, for example, publication bias. So only the positive or the significant results was published. And we never share our data. And we never share our code. And all these problems really made me feel that we didn't do things right. At that time, I also have the chance to go to as an exchange student to Oxford. At that time, I happened to attend a conference. So they have a discussion about reproducibility and open science. So I heard that science is about your method and the question you're asking, not about the results you get, positive or negative. So I was really like converted to a strong supporter to open science. I think that's the right way to do science. Another concern I have as an early researcher.
I think I just wanted to jump in here, right? Sure. So I can very well understand here how with all these experiences you have made as a young researcher has also led you to action. And one of those that I previously mentioned is the Chinese Open Science Network, which, if I'm informed correctly, you have also started at your time at Tsinghua. And I'm just wondering, how did you lay out that project and how did it grow to what it become to be now?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm going to tell you. Thank you for asking. So after I getting back from UK, I feel that the international community of psychology is changing. Some journals, they are taking actions. For example, they started to ask authors to open data doing pre-registration. And also they ask you have to justify your sample size. But all this kind of stuff, all this kind of new standard are long had from our own training in China. So I feel that actually a crisis for it's like a career development crisis, because we as early career researcher, we hope to be engaged in the psychological science on globally instead of just in China, right? But if we are trained in a way that was abandoned by the international community, then our future will be very difficult. So I'm worried not only about myself, but our generation. So I think it's very important to let graduate students know what was happening, what is the problem in our practice, in our way of doing science. The other is what kind of change was happening around the world. So after I getting back, I started to write a Chinese article to introduce the problem. So to give an overview of the replication crisis and the reform. But it's a big challenge if you are not trained with this kind of new technique and knowledge and work. So I write a Chinese article and I also start to organize workshop. And I think at that year after, because I'm back from UK at August, and then we have a newer conference for the Chinese Psychology Society. So I applied for a pre-conference workshop about reproducibility and open science. At that time, I was a graduate student. I'm not sure whether I'm the first graduate students applying for organizing a workshop. Previously, I think most of workshops are organized by professors. But I tried because I think it's so important. And then actually, I was somehow get approved. So people allow me to go there and hold a workshop. And I go to Xi'an, so in West North City in China. And then I have the first workshop. I think more than 150 people. Most of them are students, PhD students or master students. They attended this workshop. And so to keep this community growing, well, the first idea is that after workshop, how did these people who are interested in open science communicate with each other? So we started WeChat group, the social media we are using in China. We started a WeChat group. We share information about open science and reproducibility. And also before the workshop, I started a WeChat official account. It's like a blog. You can publish some articles so that people can read and can share with each other. That account was created firstly to post announcements of the workshop. But after the workshop, we think it's still useful. So we post some translations on that. For example, translation of the blogs in English or some events happening in international community. So then the subscribers of these accounts keep growing. And then people start to join me, saying that, okay, Chuan-Peng, you are doing great thing, but the editing, the typesetting of your blog is really ugly. Maybe I can help. So they join us, they join me, and they start to do more things. And also, for example, when we're trying to translate something, usually I cannot do it just by my own. So usually I will post an recruitment on that WeChat account. People would just email me and saying that, okay, I will help you to translate this. So slowly the community will keep growing. And then it comes to 2019, the COVID. So at that time, all of us have to keep the social distance and most of us stay at home. So we think that maybe we can do something. So we start to organize online talks. And because of the online talk, more early career researchers joined me. Most of them are postdocs. So they started to invite speakers, organize the talks. Yeah, before that, we have a journal club. So we read papers related to reproducibility and new methods. And we call it open minds. So because I think this kind of article is really broaden the horizon of students. So we call it open minds. We hope that people are open-minded, and also this will make their minds more open. Yeah, so we have this kind of online events. So I think then Chinese-speaking researchers in psychology and in cognitive neuroscience starting to knowing us because we have translated a lot of very helpful blogs. We also translated some sources. For example, I think one of the earliest blog we are translating is about open database for face stimuli. In psychology, a large group of people are studying how human processes human face. So they need this kind of stimuli. And I think that some researcher, they combine all these kind of resources. So we translate it into Chinese, and it's very popular because many graduate students, they need that for their training. And then we started to also telling international colleagues what we are doing. We have our social media, and we're telling people that, okay, most Chinese researchers don't know that, but still we are trying to promote the idea of open science. Then we'll find that international speakers are really helpful, are really supportive. They agree to give talk without only because we cannot offer honorary to our speakers. So then the community started growing. Yeah.
Oh, what a wonderful organization that is that you have built with your colleagues. And for
Thank you.
And for the last few minutes, I always like to have a brief outlook on the future and where work and research might be going. So in light of your open science network, how do you aim to continue in your engagement in this area?
Yeah, I think for the Open Science Network, we are trying to recruit new members so that we have maybe next generation leadership instead of we are doing all the things all the time. Because many of us now become faculty members and our time become limited for the network. Yeah, but I think because many graduate students or postdoc, they knew that we are doing what we are doing is for the big good or for the common goods of the community. So many of them also willing to join us. As for my own research, I think I'm also trying to find a way to balance the time I invested in promoting open science and the time for doing substantive research. So currently in other countries, I think most countries in the world still, they have an incentive system that reward the substantive research instead of open science or meta research. If you are in Department of Psychology, but of course, if you are in Department of Library or Science of Science, maybe they have a different criteria. But I am in the School of Psychology. So for example, when I apply in grants, maybe many of my publications cannot be put in the reference list because they are not substantive research topic. So I try to balance the two. So recently my research or starting to converge. I trying to use the method I have learned from open science and reproducibility to my own research. So how people process their self-related information. So recently I tried to build database. So for this topic, we're starting to create some meta research. So we connect all the papers related to, for example, self-referential task, and we're not conducting meta-analysis, but we just extract all the data from these papers and put them together as a database so that people can somehow reuse it. Our group also will benefit from this database, of course. I was trying to use like cognitive modeling, as I just mentioned. Even I start to know modeling very late, but I think this is a very amazing way to make our hypothesis more concrete and forcible instead of just a very vague verbal theory. So I trying to apply modeling in my own research as well. I also trying to maybe improve the measurements as well. As you have mentioned, I also emphasize measurements in the research approach I'm employing because in 2018, when I attended one conference, so SIPS, which is Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, one session is about what a mess our current measurement is, because we actually have measurement with the same name, but they are measuring different things. And we also have a measurement with different names, but they are measuring the same thing. So I trying to figure out how we can improve the measurement of self-related information processing. Yeah, but of course, these are actually at a very early stage because I started to combine these two just maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Still, many projects are going on, and I'm still looking forward to the results, how it goes.
Yeah, it seems there is still a whole lot of work to be done. Perhaps we can continue this conversation a few years down the line or so. But for today, I think we are running out of time. So I wish to round up this episode at this point. And I'm very grateful for you being on and sharing your expertise. Maybe one more short question. If people listening were interested in what you're doing and wish to get in contact with you, how can they most easily do that?
Well, I think they can, if some of our audience are interested in my research, you can visit my website or just shoot me an email. I think, Robin, you can put my email and my website at the show notes.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I will do that then. And again, I appreciate that you've been my final guest. This has been my last episode for delving into Asian psyches. And I've been grateful for everyone who tuned in and hope I managed to contribute to a better understanding of the subject that I and Chuan-Peng love.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, one last advertisement. So for international students, master students or PhD students, if you are interested in doing a PhD or master degree in with me together, you can always apply. I think the Chinese government have fundings for international students as well. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Great
plug.
Sorry.
Sure, go ahead, because this podcast has been a production for the Gen A Fellowship at Asia Society Switzerland, which is an organization that enhances East and West conversation here in Zurich. And please wish me luck to get selected for a slot at State of Asia. It's the flagship conference of the organization taking place in Zurich later this year. And if you are here and wish to hear more from experts from Asia, why not consider attending, and we might see each other there. And for all others, I highly value your time and attention on this format. Now that there's nothing left to say, but thank you for listening, and I wish you continue to have a wonderful time. Bye-bye.